It was the dawn of the third age of podcasting, 30 years after the series had launched.
The Babylon podcast was a dream given form. Its goal, to discuss the place where humans and aliens could work out their differences peacefully.
It's a port of call, home away from home for established fans, newbies, Jon, Blaine, and guests.
Humans and aliens wrapped in 2,500,000 tons of spinning metal, all alone in the night.
It can be a dangerous place.
Wait, what?
But it's our last, best hope for peace.
This is the story of the last of the Babylon stations.
The year is 2024.
The name of the podcast is
Babylon 5, 30 years later. Welcome to the latest episode of Babylon 5, 30 years later. The podcast where we look at episodes of Babylon 5, 30 years after their original broadcast date, and see how they fit into the bigger picture in a spoiler-free, first-time listener-friendly format, because of our two hosts, one of us has seen the episodes so far, the other one has not. If you're joining us for the first time, I am the host who has seen this series before. My name is Blaine Dowler, and joining me is the ever-present co-host, Jon. How are you doing, Jon?
I am doing well. I was thinking about, implicating you in some sort of crime today, but I just got kind of busy, so I didn't.
Okay. I appreciate that, especially since we're in two different countries, so the extradition would be nasty.
Well, what are friends for?
Anyway, in case you're wondering why we did a little more of an intro and background into ourselves than we have done in the past, it's in case some of us are coming in for the first time. Because this particular episode, which was episode 11 in broadcast and episode 11 in the production order. It's unusual in season 1 for those two numbers to match. Survivors, about an explosion in one of the fighter bays just before the arrival of President Santiago. And, Garibaldi is the man who's accused of it. The president's security chief has a personal issue with Garibaldi because she blames him for her father's death. And he certainly didn't cause that, although it was basically targeted to punish him as well.
Mm-hmm.
This episode was directed by Jim Johnston and written by Marc Scott Zicree. Now, typically, when we are talking about a writer's first time writing for this series, because there are so few of them, we sit down and do a little bit of a bio, figure out, what we can about their history, how J. Michael Straczynski came, they found themselves on Straczynski's radar to be part of the project. Now, Jon and I could talk about what we have researched and what we have found in that regard, but this time we were very, very fortunate to have a much better source of information for this. Marc Scott Zicree himself was very kind and offered us a good chunk of his time earlier this week, so we were able to hear it right from the man himself, his history of Babylon 5 and other series in which he worked with Straczynski, and a bit about this episode. So we will now share that interview with you and then come back to complete our discussion. So we wanted to talk about, how you and JMS started working together, because going through the IMDb, it seems like when he has hiring authority, you get hired. At least for a lot of the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, it's interesting. We go way back, and feel free to ask me anything. I'm happy to answer any question you have. Basically, right out of college, by the time I got out of college, I had sold one short story. I'd gotten an art degree, painting, sculpture, and graphic arts, and but I knew I wanted to be a writer, producer, in television. The three shows that made me want to be a writer were Star Trek, Twilight Zone, and Outer Limits, the originals of those. Mm-hmm. And right out of college, I started writing the Twilight Zone companion, but also my friend Michael Reeves, who I met in a class taught by Theodore Sturgeon, was writing animation, and he asked me if I'd like to write animation with him and break into TV that way. So I did. So I started writing for Smurfs and He-Man and Super Friends and so on and so forth. And I never wanted to particularly write animation, but I wanted to write for shows like Star Trek and so forth. But this was a way in, and it was a great way to learn my craft. And I basically wrote for almost every major show in animation for several years. And at the same time, Michael and I were friends with a whole circle of science fiction writers who also were, just starting to write for animation. And I met Joe Straczynski through through mutual friends, we started going to the same events and parties and got to know each other, he and Catherine Drennan, and who he was married to at the time. And I liked Joe. He had been writing newspaper articles, and Michael and I thought he'd be, he'd be great writing for animation. So Joe's memory is that he got hired by Arthur Nadell, separate from us recommending him. But I know that Michael and I were both talking Joe up to Arthur Nadell at Filmation, and Joe got hired and was very good at it. Of course, he had a lot of imagination. He had a very strong work ethic, and could write a lot very fast. And so he rose quickly, and so our careers were sort of paralleling each other. We both were huge fans of Rod Serling. I'd been writing the Twilight Zone companion parts of it were serialized in Twilight Zone magazine before the book came out, and Joe was reading those, and we were, talking about Rod a lot, and Night Gallery and Twilight Zone and so forth. And we became very good friends. And so then Joe, often we were writing on the same shows, and then Joe got hired to story edit Real Ghostbusters. Chuck Menville and Len Jansen, who were writing team, were hired to sort of do the Slimer stuff, and Joe was hired to do, Real Ghostbusters. And so Len and Chuck had a very different view of what the show should be than Joe did. Len and Chuck wanted to do something kind of like funny animal, goofy. They worked on, they had run the writing team on Smurfs, and they were delightful men and wonderful men and very funny. But Joe wanted to do the show exactly like we were writing sequels to the movie. He was running it basically like almost like a live action show. And of course, for Michael Reeves and myself, this was great. That's exactly what we wanted to do. And the movie wasn't even available in home video yet, but so they sent us a videotape of the movie to study. I'd seen it, of course, in the theaters, and we loved it. And so I ended up writing a number of the Real Ghostbuster scripts, with Joe story editing them. And we were very much on the same wavelength, and so I was given great creative freedom. And but then also at the same time, Joe, I knew, was incredibly ambitious, and so I was hired to develop a show called Captain Power and the Soldiers of the Future. And so I spent a year developing that. It came right off He-Man. Mattel had underwritten He-Man. There's a whole story there, and they've been documentaries about that. And that was a huge success. And so then they decided to do a live action show, science fiction show, dystopic, that would have these toys, these figures, and these guns you could theoretically shoot at the screen and so forth. And so I spent a year developing, because when I came in on it, I was hired to develop the show. All you really had was the names of the characters. In some case I even changed the names, but not the backstories, not the warp and woof of the show. And what would make you want to watch it particularly, other than there was going to be a lot of fighting. And so I worked up all of the characters and the backstories. And, Captain Power's father is named after my father. Stuart Gordon Zicree became Stuart Gordon Power in the show, and so on and so forth. And so after a year, they wanted to hire me to story edit it. And I was writing features at the time, and thought, well, gee, I can't do it. And but then they were going to hire someone who was just, I thought, going to wreck it. So my wife Elaine said, well, you've got to change that. You've got to intercede. So I thought, well, I've worked with Joe, and Joe is great. And so I said to Doug Netter and his partner, I said, you haven't ever heard of this guy, and he's only story edited animation, but I'll guarantee him, if you hire him as story editor instead of the person you're considering, I will back him. So if he can't do the job, I'll step in and do the job. So they hired Joe. And of course, Doug Netter and John Copeland, the two producers, ultimately became the two producers who produced Babylon 5 with Joe. And so that was sort of the DNA of that. And so it led directly into Babylon 5.
Yeah, and it's funny hearing you talk about this, because I look at your IMDb, and this was all the must-see television when I was growing up in the 80s.
Yeah,
because...
a lot of people come up to me and say, you're responsible for my childhood.
Yeah, a lot of that.
Just a bit, yeah.
Yeah. I did not miss Real Ghostbusters, but...
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Finish the thought, and then I'll...
So, yeah, I would often change the channel when the Slimer part came on, because it did feel like the two halves of that hour.
Yes.
The first half was aimed at an audience several years older than the second half.
Yeah. Yes, very deliberately. And so, for instance, because we all felt that Slimer was goofy and silly and a show for little kids. And we certainly had the capabilities to write that if we had chosen to. I never ended up writing for Slimer, and I didn't particularly want to. But with Joe, I mean, Michael Reeves and I and all the other writers, we were told to write satire and to basically match the tone of the original movie. And so when I did things like satirizing, broadcast television or any of the other ones I wrote, I could satirize Geraldo Rivera and 60 Minutes and all these different adult references and it didn't matter whether the kids got those references. The thing was that we were able to just have fun. And I created a character who was a mashup of Gumby and Rambo, and he was called Gumbo. And stuff like that, just weird gags. And so that's what happened with all of that. But we were all of us in our early 20s at that point, more or less. And so so we weren't much older than the audience that was watching these shows. I mean, maybe 10 years older, but not there's not that's why many of us are still kind of in the industry all these years later, because we weren't that old when we started. I was just right out of college at 22, 23 years old.
Captain Power was another one I never missed, because if I had to summarize it quickly to tell people what it was, this was a live action show for children, Saturday mornings, serialized storytelling, so episodes had consequences later, that was as close as you could get to the future we see in the Terminator movies without violating copyright in a lot of ways.
Yes.
I think the big difference between Captain Power and He-Man is that the He-Man toys were good and fun and exciting, and the Captain Power toys were a great concept that were not produced with the quality required to deliver on that concept.
Yes, and the technology wasn't really there when we were working up the show. We said, well, what's this signal that's going to come out of the TV to register with the toys? And they said, well, you won't be able to see it; it won't be visible. And then, of course, when we saw it on the produced show, it was this flashing green thing, and it was appalling. And we were going, oh, Jesus Christ! And the toys really didn't work. They didn't effectively interact with the TV. It was a hugely expensive show. It was $1 million per half hour, which is insane back then. I mean,
that's crazy.
Yeah, it was huge. I mean, Babylon 5, just to put it in perspective, was like, I think $638,000 per episode in the first season, never cracked $1 million in the 5 years. And so Mattel was just, spending through the roof on it. And I'm sure that there was an entire season of scripts written. Second season, they bought scripts for the entire season, and those were never shot. Scripts by Michael Reeves and Christy Marks and on and on. And so I don't know if they've ever been published or, but some fan somewhere should now, with the technology we have now, a fan group could shoot those scripts, and I think that'd be a worthy thing to do, actually.
I would say that aired. I remember it was, I think it was in grade 7, telling my classmates, no, I don't care if it's Saturday morning, try it. It's actually good.
Well, the idea I had with it when I was hired by Gary Goddard was, it was exactly what we did with Real Ghostbusters, which was, I want this to be exactly as if it were an adult show. I do not want to shift down, even though it's aimed at children. I wanted it to be a continuing story with an arc. I actually worked out a 5-year arc for this show. There's a Bible I wrote that was close to 100 pages, and that was before even Joe was brought on. But the whole idea with Jennifer being part of the Dread Youth and all that, those were all things I came up with. Originally, she was named Tiffany. When I came in, I thought that was ridiculous, so I named her Jennifer after a friend of mine. And all this stuff with Tank and him losing a son and all these things. I was trying to give texture to it and emotional depth, and so that was built into it from the beginning. I thought, this was the lesson I learned from Rod Serling, which was you don't assume your audience is stupid. You assume that they're smart, and people used to ask me when I was writing animation, do you write for the child in the audience? And I said, no, I write for the child in myself. And so it's like I'm writing to entertain myself, and my instincts are very good in that way. And so if it entertains me, there's a strong probability it'll entertain an audience. So, and that's worked for the last 40 years.
Yeah, speaking as someone who was the child in those audiences, I can tell you, yes, it did work.
Yes. Yes, exactly. So I'm very glad of that. But it was so that was really the first time either Joe or I were really writing toward a budget and trying to figure out what the budget was going to be. And Doug Netter and John Copeland hadn't really done production of a TV show before, certainly nothing like this. And so they didn't know what they could afford, what they could not afford. When I wrote the pilot of the show, I was very strongly influenced by Aliens, and of course Terminator, as you mentioned, but very much Aliens in terms of that whole notion of that group of Marines and the way they fought and the way they interacted. So, and I love the fact in Aliens that you had men and women who were both sort of equal on an equal footing. And I was married to a very strong woman, still am, and I like writing a strong female character. So that was another thing that really appealed to me, not have her be just sort of the boy toy kind of character. So, there's a lot of stuff, a lot of fun stuff in there.
Yeah, very much so. I know you. I heard your name first on the Twilight Zone podcast that Tom Elliott does.
Yes.
When he was pulling it up with the Twilight Zone companion. Because I admit, when I was a kid, I wasn't reading credits. So even though I would have seen your name many times, it didn't register.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because I've had such a diverse career. When people come up to me to compliment me on my work, sometimes it could be the Twilight Zone companion, it could be Star Trek: The Next Generation, or Babylon 5, or Sliders, or even Space Command, the project I'm doing now at my own studio. So it's really fun to have worked on so many things that are so iconic, and I'm very blessed because when I was 10, Star Trek debuted, the original Star Trek, and I recorded it. I was 10 years old, and I recorded it on reel-to-reel audio tape in case it never aired again. And that's before VCRs, of course. And I got to go on the set, and I met Nichelle Nichols and all. It was a dream come true, and I wanted to be part of that world. And the fact that I got to be is just the coolest thing ever. And so I'm very, very lucky.
Yeah, and not just a part of it. If my favorite Star Trek is Deep Space Nine, and I find if you're talking in the community, ask Deep Space Nine fans, what's your favorite episode? They only give 3 answers, and you got story credit on one of them.
Yeah, Far Beyond the Stars. Yeah, and again, that all comes from me growing up with the classic, right? I noticed when I was a kid that Twilight Zone and Outer Limits and Star Trek were written by the same people, essentially, who were also writing the books and short stories I was reading. Theodore Sturgeon and Ray Bradbury and Harlan Ellison and Charles Beaumont and Richard Matheson and on and on. And so as soon as I was old enough, since I was a teenager, I started going to science fiction conventions, and these people became friends and mentors. And Ted Sturgeon, particularly, was a great influence, a great friend. And I wanted to pay homage to those writers of the 50s who were writing for a penny a word or 5 cents a word, who were writing for the love of it, without whom you wouldn't have Star Trek or Star Wars or any of these things. And so that was sort of the way in on Far Beyond the Stars. And then, of course, it went from there. The racial element, of course, was terrific. And when I outlined the story, I was actually producing Sliders, and I called Harlan Ellison to get information about that period, and he was very gracious, considering the fact that he was very embittered against Star Trek because of what had happened on rewriting him on City on the Edge of Forever. And but he was very gracious, and he was a good friend too, and a dear man, and though a firecracker certainly. And but then the only reason I didn't write the script on Far Beyond the Stars was because I was writing 2 episodes of Sliders back to back, and Ira Bear said, "If you quit your job, I'll give you the script, to write on Far Beyond the Stars." And I considered it, but I couldn't. And I actually had the bandwidth. I could have written the script easily, but I just couldn't quit Sliders and leave everyone I was working with, screwed. So that was, but we all knew Far Beyond the Stars was going to be a classic Star Trek episode, even before I wrote the outline. We knew, because it was just such a amazing idea.
So when you worked with Babylon 5, how did that conversation start?
I read the pilot script of Babylon 5 years before Joe sold it. We had the same agent. Initially, there were animation writers didn't have agents, but then Michael Reeves was the first animation writer that we knew got an agent. Her name was Candy Montero. And soon, within a very short time, all of us were clients of Candy's, including Joe. And so he wrote the pilot for Babylon 5, and I read it way before it sold. And I thought it was terrific. I just thought it was wonderful. Somewhere in my files, I have that script still. And so when Joe sold it and they shot the pilot, I watched it, and it was very, very interesting because they waited a year. Warner's waited a year to greenlight the series because they finished the pilot and aired the pilot and saw what the response was, and on the basis of that, they greenlit the show. And so they had torn down all those sets. Nothing was left standing, and so they had to start over. They had to basically build those sets from scratch. And so early on, I met with Joe, and because I said I'd like to write one, and so we got together, and he gave me the series Bible for Babylon 5. It was one of the most enigmatic series Bibles I'd ever read, because it said, for instance, that at the end of season one of the main characters will undergo a transformation. And I said, which character, Joe? What transformation? And he said, well, I can't tell you. And so it's very hard to I mean, you were left, not knowing what he was. Clearly, he had a plan. He kept talking about the 5-year arc and the, which I mean, because I'd done that same thing on Captain Power, and 5-year arc and encrypted and all that stuff. I once asked him. I said, with this 5-year arc stuff, is it any? Would you have triple encrypted and under lock and key? I said, is it like a novel that tells this whole story, or what is it? And he said, well, no, it's just kind of notes and stuff. And I thought, oh, okay, I got it. And so he had a notion of Garibaldi falling off the wagon and losing his protection as being a cop. And so that was the one that I wrote. And I named the character Kemmer after Ed Kemmer, who starred in the great live science fiction show Space Patrol of the 50s, which I met Ed Kemmer. I had lunch with him at one point before his death, and he was an amazing guy and a wonderful actor. And so in Space Command, it's Captain Jack Kemmer. And again, I'm paying that same kind of homage here. But but the thing was, they were just building the sets. So I actually went and with the art director, laid out the blueprints to make sure that what I was writing would work physically for what they were building. And but fortunately, they'd shot the pilot, so I knew who the main characters were. I thought Mira Furlan was just terrific as Delenn, and I loved Andreas Katsalas and Peter Jurasik. I mean, it was a very strong cast, and so they were enormous fun to write for. And Mira Furlan, of course, when I met her on Babylon 5 at the wrap party, interestingly enough, for the first season, I said to her, I want to work with you again. I'm going to write something for you. And it was 20 years before I was able to, but I wrote a lead for her in Space Command, and she's phenomenal in it. We just completed the first 2 hours, and sadly, of course, we lost Mira to West Nile virus during the pandemic. But God, she was an amazing actress, and so yeah. But that's how that kind of came about. And Joe and Larry rewrote the script, but that was, I think, because they really didn't quite know how to work with, giving notes and stuff. I think there was a discomfort early on in that way, because certainly the rewrite they wanted, I could have easily done. But
along those lines, one of the things I was curious about, or what were some, at first, it's kind of crazy that you're writing this so far in advance.
Yeah.
We're well into the first season watching it, but none of that existed when you're writing it. What were some examples of some story points that they gave you to include versus story points that you came up with to include?
But just to make one point about writing a show before they're in production. This would happen to us often, particularly in animation. You'd come in and they wouldn't even have any footage. They might have some character drawings of what the characters looked like, very little. And so, like with Smurfs and He-Man and so forth, that was often the case. And on many other shows that I've written for, there'd be nothing. I mean, even Space Command, I had to write it and build everything to be able to shoot it. But in terms of the storyline, I don't remember, but my memory of it, which may or may not be accurate, but I think it is, was like, okay, he falls off the wagon, outline it. So I outlined it, and it was like so there weren't a lot of edicts given to me. I just kind of wrote the way I thought the story would play, and then and it was great fun writing a scene between Jakar and Londo, because they had such strong personalities and voices. It was great to write that. And later I took Peter Jurasik to lunch when I was a producer on Sliders, at Universal, and he told me that I was the only producer who had ever taken him to lunch. And sadly, I wasn't able to work with him again because he died so soon, you know. But he was a wonderful man, and you know, great, absolutely great in Babylon 5. I'm so glad he got the role that showed the full strength of his abilities, because it's a rare thing for an actor to get that opportunity.
You mentioned that the main concept that was at the root of the story was that Garibaldi falls off the wagon.
Yeah.
Now, I am coming at this show fresh. I have not seen past this episode.
Mm-hmm.
So it's possible that the answer to my question is watch and find out.
Yeah.
But it seemed that he was able to sober up and get back on again relatively easily at the end of the. What were the conversations around that?
Well, you know, it's interesting because in my original draft, it was much, I think his alcoholism was treated a lot more seriously. I felt it was a little glib in the final version. I thought it was like treated a little more as kind of like a fun kind of thing, a romp kind of thing. Later in the show, I know they came back and dealt with this issue more, but I actually went to, AA meetings and talked to alcoholics and did a lot of kind of footwork before I wrote the script to kind of get inside the headset, because I'm not an alcoholic, and I don't drink, in fact, but I wanted to be able to really get inside that headset. But so I was not that happy with the final version of the episode, with the changes they made in it, though the way they built to a climax was stronger than what I did. And it was when I read the script, when they included it in that book of scripts, I reread it after many years, having, you know, from when I wrote it, and I thought, how did I miss this? You know, it's like it needed a bigger payoff than what I'd given it. And so it was like Joe was right in that way. And but I think really my feeling at the time was that Joe was trying to ramp up to where he could write all of them, and he didn't know that first season if he had the strength, the actual endurance to be able to write that many. Because, you know, nowadays when we have seasons that are like 6 episodes, you know, or 10 episodes, that's a cakewalk. I mean, that's for those of us who came up in television 20 or 30 years ago. I mean, man, a six. I mean, like the outline I'm writing now is a 6-hour miniseries. It's like, man, I could write this thing easily. But when you're talking about 22 episodes or 26 episodes, I mean, that's a lot for one guy to write, particularly if he's executive producer overseeing, you know, all the other aspects of production. I mean, John Copeland and Doug Netter were handling a lot of the heavy lifting of production, but Joe was there every day. I mean, they basically took a warehouse, converted it into a studio, had all the offices there as well. So VFX and all this stuff was right there. And Joe told me that basically his schedule was he would get to the office around 10 in the morning. He would do his executive producer job until about 5-ish. He'd go home and, you know, eat dinner. And then from like 7 to like 2 in the morning, he would write. And then from 2 in the morning to 4 in the morning, he would interact with the fans on what existed of the internet back then. And then from like 4 in the morning till, you know, 9 in the morning, he'd sleep. And he did that for 5 years. And he said he might be able to write a little bit during the day, but it was very difficult. And in fact, at one point he was writing at the office, and he wanted, the people not to disturb him. And so he put, you know, on the door, he put something like, you know, do not disturb, and that didn't work. And he put, you know, I'm inside writing, don't knock, and that didn't work. Finally, he figured out what he could put on the door that did work was simply a sign that said, not now. And that was funny. That was great. And but yeah, I mean, what I've been doing now with Space Command is very much informed by what Joe and John Copeland did in terms of building the machine for Babylon 5, except with the difference that now that you can basically crowdfund and sell investment shares and reach your audience via the internet. I have my own network, Mr. Sci-Fi, on YouTube. I've raised $3.5 million via my fans. We're shooting hour 6 of Space Command of a 12-hour season. I just wrote this book, Greenlighting Yourself, that just came out. My publisher, Silman James, just put it out to tell people how to do this, because, you know, Joe was really a pioneer with Babylon 5 in the fact that as I said, for showrunners, people like Ron Moore and, you know, everybody basically in drama and science fiction, our hero was Rod Serling. Rod Serling was the first modern showrunner. Prior to Rod, producers ran network TV. Rod was the first writer who ran the show. And Rod wrote 92 episodes out of 156. And I think Joe was trying to match that or beat that. And so I think the first season, the reason Joe gave a few assignments to people like Dorothy Fontana and me and so forth was he was trying to get it to a point where he could write all of them, and he didn't know if he would have the endurance. And so the first season was sort of a dry run to see if he could get up to that pace. And then once he knew he could, then he wrote almost all of them. And then, but of course, what happened was he thought he was not going to get that fifth season, so he hurried up and finished the 5-year arc in 4 years. And then, of course, Turner picked up the show for a fifth, and then it was sort of like, okay, what do we do now? And he was friendly with Neil Gaiman, of course, so Neil wrote one, and Harlan was supposed to write one, but he never got around to doing it. So he brought in Harlan as a consultant and so forth. But I think one of the reasons he used David Gerrold and Dorothy Fontana, DC Fontana, and Harlan sort of on the first, round of people was to legitimize Babylon 5, to say, look, we know the DNA of science fiction, and the fact that we have Harlan and DC Fontana and David Gerrold, who are the three great writers from Star Trek, we know what we're doing. I think because Joe was basically taking a science fiction novel structurally and applying it to television science fiction. And he told me that what his influence was Hill Street Blues. That's where he really saw that you could arc a story and tell a big story over the course of a show. But the reason for that, by the way, and because that was verboten in the early years of television, it used to be that TV was syndicated after its network run, and then it would air in any order at all. So every episode had to be exactly like every other episode. So, for instance, you could watch the first episode of Star Trek and the last episode of Star Trek, the original show, and they were, Kirk, Spock, McCoy, same deal. Mm-hmm. When home video came in, particularly DVDs, but also VHS, then people could buy an entire season of a show, and it was a sales incentive to have it tell a big story, so that you wouldn't have to wait a year to watch the story and see what the beginning, middle, and end were. You could buy it and watch it all in a weekend. And so that was why TV started to change, where you could have an arcing story. And that's what Babylon 5, was able to, enjoy that great luxury of a big story.
I had never thought of it as being marketing driven. I mean, that makes all the sense because it's a commercial endeavor to make TV shows. But
yes.
I just was this artistic movement toward, continued stories.
Yes. And also, by the way, we all knew each other. And so, all of us writing science fiction for TV, a lot of us knew the prose writers as well. So, for instance, Ira Bear and those guys on DS9 were watching Babylon 5 and starting to change the structure of DS9 to make it more of an arcing story, to make it more structurally similar to Babylon 5. It was, we were not, we were curious, for instance, there was, on my side, there was no enmity between any of these people. I was applauding what Joe was doing. I was applauding what they were doing on DS9. I'm the only writer who wrote for both DS9 and Babylon 5. And, it's funny because when the two shows debuted the same year, people were saying, well, you can't have two shows about space stations. One of them's got to fail, if not both. But of course, Babylon 5 and DS9 are so different tonally and in every way that it was fine. And though the funny thing, of course, is that DS9 was enormously more expensive per episode than Babylon 5. As I mentioned, Babylon 5 was never cracked $1 million per episode, and DS9 was up near $2.5-3 million per episode. So I once said to John Copeland, what's the difference? How are you able to get more creature makeups, more fight scenes, more visual effects than they are when you have less than you have half the money? And he said, other people will read a script and say this can't be done. I'll read a script and say, how can it be done? And I thought that was the paradigm shift that made it possible. And he was absolutely right. So, and Ron Thornton, of course, who was the great designer of the VFX on Captain Power and then on Babylon 5, then he and I worked together on a number of other shows as well, including Space Command. So it's so we're all like one big family. So the main thing is that all of us you can tell from Babylon 5, you can tell from Deep Space Nine, I think, and also many of the really great science fiction shows, that all of us had an enormous enthusiasm and love of the stories we were telling. We weren't doing it for the buck. I mean, it's nice that writers get paid really well, but that's not what it's about. It's about telling stories from our hearts that we just love, creating something fresh and original and different that that an audience around the world will love, that millions of people will love, and that people will love for generations. And so even from the beginning, Joe and I and Michael Reeves and all these other wonderful writers knew exactly what they were doing. No one was approaching this with cynicism or with anything but their A game, and we were all learning from one another. So it was really wonderful, and still is wonderful. I'm still as excited walking onto the Space Command sets as I was walking onto the Star Trek sets when I was 10, or the Babylon 5 sets when I was, however old I was back then in my 20s. So we're all very blessed. I mean, Joe has certainly accomplished what he set out to do, and whether or not Warner's makes a new Babylon 5, and I think they should, the work stands. Thank God.
Yeah, having seen the whole thing, I mean, I trust if Joe's going to do the remake, he's not going to do a retread.
No.
This is going to be probably closer to Hitchcock's when he remade his own The Man Who Knew Too Much.
Yes.
Where the explanation on the back of the DVD might match for that paragraph, but then you sit down and watch it and you go, yeah, 85 of these 90 minutes are completely different.
Yes. Well, again, I mean, you can just the commitment to quality. I mean, the fact that they reshot the pilot to, polish it up after several years when they had the money to do it, that was great. So there's two different versions of the pilot, but also I think Joe probably is thinking, okay, well, not just what would the audience want now, but what would be of interest and validity to him, where he's not just singing his greatest hits. So. Yeah. I think for all of us, we're looking for the way to keep our work fresh, to keep our work valid and vital. And it's I mean, I'm so blessed that I got to come up with such talented people and also got to learn. And Joe, I'm sure, would feel the same way. I mean, the fact that he named a character Alfred Bester, that's his tip of the hat, just like mine is with Ed Kemmer of Space Patrol. It's like and all the characters in Space Command are named after classic science fiction writers, Clifford Simak and Ray Bradbury and Ted Sturgeon and so forth. We were reading, because we grew up in the late 60s through the 70s. We were reading the science fiction written primarily in the 40s and 50s, particularly the 50s, and we grew up during the space race, the landing on the moon. So we know whose shoulders we're standing on, and rather than trying to say, oh God, we came full formed out of Zeus's forehead or whatever. No, we learned from these masterful writers who taught us, and then we go on to create our work that has its own individual stamp, but also has a resonance of what came before. So it's really fun.
Well, I don't know how we're doing for time on your end, because I know.
Well, we can talk for a few more minutes, then I have to peel off because I'm doing that outline. But if you have a couple more questions that you wanted to ask, I'm happy to answer them.
Okay.
John, I have a really minor thing. It was just something I thought about in the episode and I was curious about.
Sure.
So Kemmer has a very, severe is a rude word. So professional or very trim appearance through most of the episode. And then at the end of the episode, whenever she and Garibaldi have made friends, she presents herself very differently. She has her hair done and everything. Was that a you choice, or was that a director's choice? Or
that was after it left my my word processor. But one thing I did do, just kind of as oddly that ended up having some resonance, was I was the first person to name one of the other security officers. I named him Lou, and because I thought that was a nice blue collar kind of name, and that then became the name of the character moving forward. So that was fun, and
that's fun.
But I also liked the character of Garibaldi. I thought he had a really great blue collar quality. He sort of looked a little like Bruce Willis. He had a kind of a Bruce Willis vibe at the time, and it was funny because I remember the actor mentioning Jerry Doyle mentioning that when he auditioned for, I think it was for Babylon 5, he didn't have any credits, and so he put on his resume, among his credits on his headshot, he had the credit that he had danced he had been a dancer in the dance theater of Harlem, and which was an all-black troupe. And his I think his idea was, well, at least there'll be something on the resume, but if they call me on it, I can say, well, that's obviously a joke, So, but these were delightful people, delightful characters. And I went on the set on Babylon 5 when they were shooting the episode, uh, and it was really great to be there with them and see the sets. And actually, I think it may not have even been my episode, because I remember Bill Mumy was there in makeup, and I'm working with Bill now on Space Command, and I also I brought. It was interesting because when I cast Bill and Mira Furlan, Bill brought Bruce Boxleitner. It was the first time the three of them had worked together since Babylon 5. And so that's now on the pilot of Space Command, which is on Mr. Sci-Fi, and we're selling the Blu-rays and DVDs. We're just about to release them. So, but these are wonderful actors. They deserve to be remembered forever because they did the work that's worth remembering.
Absolutely. There's a lot of the actors I don't know on Babylon 5, you can see them in other things, but nothing that provides the range they have.
No, it's true. And it's interesting because you have to, as a writer, you really have to bring that. And so what I tend to do is I write roles for specific actors like Doug Jones and Mira, Bill Mumy, Bob Picardo. It's sort of like, and with Mira, I had lunch with her before I cast her in Space Command, and I said, because she was so amazing and so different when I first saw her as Delenn, and I said, I don't know much about your character. I was writing it specifically for her, but I said, she's a xenoarchaeologist. She has a firing but loving relationship with her grown daughter, and she's not defined by a man. And she said, I'm in. So as the writer / producer, you bring respect to your actors, you bring an awareness of your talents and their talents, and hopefully together you create something greater than either of you could do on your own. And so Joe certainly did that with Babylon 5. My gosh.
That's great.
Yeah, very much so. I am really looking forward to going through this with John, because as we said, this is his first time through.
Well, it's amazing. It's great, and it's so great that you can now watch it on HBO Max, I guess, wherever they're running it, and the fact that it holds up. It does. I mean, the visual effects are not what they would do nowadays, but the stories work, the characters work, and the visual design is strong enough so that you can, it's willing suspension of disbelief, and that's okay. And
really most of the visual effects differences are just a matter of textures. I mean, the designs are solid. It's just, there's a slight, they do a couple other passes through it to be different.
Yeah, but again, that's something that they could redo at some point, and I hope they do. But again, there's some wonderful things in there. There's many, many delights to be had in Babylon 5. And for years, it's funny, I had the face of Jakar on my wall because they gave me the prosthetic that he wore as Jakar, and so now, but I think now that one is at the Museum of the Moving Image in New York. It was donated. So, but
did you have him staring down at you?
I had it contempt. Yeah, it was just such a beautiful design. I loved it, and I mean, there's so many wonderful artists working in so many different departments on Babylon 5. It was great. It's great. I worked with many of them on more recent projects as well, and very grateful to have known them.
Okay, well, we don't want to take up too much more of your time. I do want to say Ivanova was not a huge part of this episode, but boy, did you use her well.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I want to work with Claudia Christian. She and I have had conversations about that. So as soon as I find the right role for her, I very much intend to cast her. We're doing 6 new series, 5 beyond Space Command with Rockne O'Bannon and Mark Ferguson and all these other people. But so she's definitely on my list, and I look forward to it very much.
Yeah. Mark, you've peppered it throughout the discussion, but you want to kind of run down where people can be looking for you?
Yes, the best way to find me is on Mr. Sci-Fi. That's SCI-FI, Mr. Sci-Fi, the Mr. Sci-Fi channel on YouTube. Just go there, subscribe. I talk about a lot of different science fiction things that I've been involved with, and also I post stuff from Space Command there. So it's a cornucopia. So that's the best place.
Okay. Well, again, thank you very much for taking time out of your schedule to join us for this.
Thank you very much, Mark. Appreciate it so much.
It's been great fun, and let me know when you post it, and I'll put out the word.
And we're back.
Hey, it's almost like we never left, but I really, really appreciated all of just the fount of information and perspective that we got from Mr. Zicree. That was a really great interview.
Yes, I am thrilled, first of all, that he just took the time to speak to us, and then everything he provided was wonderful. So
Yeah, because going into it, which is not to speak, people are busy because they're doing stuff, but we didn't even think we'd be able to get time, much less that much time. So it was really, gracious of him to spend time with us.
yes, it was. And for those of you who are interested, he did talk about his YouTube channel. Mr. Sci-Fi is the best place to get a hold of him and see what he's up to now. If you are following our podcast, Babylon 5 30 Years Later, via YouTube, you can check out our featured channels. We have linked it there for you. So it has been there and is ready to go. That and Word Balloon with John Suntress, for reasons we will hopefully explain in about 21 more episodes time.
Teasing, not spoiling. But yeah, this was a really strong episode, and I really enjoyed it. I think that as we move into the second half of this season, the show is finding stronger topics to talk about, things that are more resonant, I think. And the conflict between Garibaldi and his friend's daughter, I'm looking up her name because it's escaping me right now. That was just, the pathos there was really, really endearing is not the right word, but it definitely reaches out to you.
Yeah, I would say gripping.
Yeah.
For the relationship between him and Major Leanna Kemmer.
Kemmer, that's right. And to find out that the person you trust is also working for a terrorist organization, that's how it always goes, right? But I was not anticipating that to be the reveal at the end. Obviously, it was no secret that Garibaldi was being played and framed, but who was doing the framing? I think maybe like 5 minutes before they revealed it, I was like, I wonder if it's that guy. But for most of the episode, I was definitely just going along for the ride.
Yeah, it's not immediately obvious, but that also means it's not a cheat either.
Mm-hmm.
Which is, sometimes when you're watching a detective series, and I have seen, so many, sometimes when they reveal it and it's a shock because they did nothing to clue you in that was the possibility.
Mm-hmm.
Here, there wasn't strong evidence pointing to that individual, but they had very effectively eliminated the red herrings.
Right.
So by the process of deduction, just knowing that the culprit is going to be a character we have met.
And also, while there wasn't strong evidence pointing to him, it was entirely in keeping with his personality and everything we had seen heretofore. So it works well on a rewatch because you're like, oh, yeah, that guy is nasty, isn't he? But, as you're going through the story.
Yeah, it's totally in character. So, yeah, I think as a detective series, it works well, which is a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one of my favorite authors for a long time has been Larry Niven. And one of his favorite characters is one that he hasn't written much. It's Gil the Arm Hamilton, because he says writing science fiction detective stories are really tough because you can have technology that changes rules, right? If you have teleportation technology or transporter technology, then that opens up so many more possibilities. Like a locked room mystery when transporters are common is no longer a locked room mystery.
Right.
Right. The fact that the body is in a locked room doesn't mean they couldn't get out.
And I asked Mr. Zicree about this. It was a minor note, but it was one that stuck out at me. As progressively minded male viewers have moved through the last couple of decades, growing perspectives on the way that women are treated and handled and written in our entertainment, I think has been part of that process. And just the idea that when Kemmer was the antagonist, she presented herself starkly. And when we are now sympathetic to her, she has presented much more becomingly. And I feel like that is an unjust treatment of her femininity. I was gratified to hear that Zicree hadn't written that it was a decision made, in the production by those on set. That, just because she is angry at Garibaldi, she does not need to look different from usual. And by converse, just because she has changed her perspective on this man doesn't mean that she needs to change her appearance. It's just, those things don't have to be connected. And they can be, but they so often are, they don't have to be.
It can be. And it was also a bit like flipping a switch.
Mm-hmm.
It was from one to the other extreme. Now, if we pay attention, we'll see that Ivanova actually softens her look over the course of the first 2 seasons, but she's doing it slowly because she came in as the XO, unfamiliar on the station, so she came in trying to give that firm authoritarian view to immediately take command, and then softened as people got to know her. So that was a conscious choice to be more stern than she genuinely was when we first meet her in Men on the Firing Line. So they decided to build that into the character. So the character came in running hard and then softened to more of her actual personality over time.
And that's something that I can see an actual person doing. I can see a person, as teachers, knowing that we might have to deal with discipline problems. A lot of teachers present a more stern, more no-nonsense front at the beginning of the year because it's easier to start firm and then soften with children than it is to start soft and expect, stricter responses later in the year. But, this is, like I said, a very, very minor point. We're talking about it more than it really deserves, but I just wanted to clarify why I asked him, just because I think that when a woman takes her hair down in response to a male character that is often associated with a romantic turn, and that is not at all the nature of these two people's relationship. And so it struck me in the moment, and I wanted to ask him about it. So yeah, like I said, gratified.
Yeah. And one other point that he brought up, I just wanted to expand upon, because he wasn't involved and familiar with the numbers, but they've been covered by JMS and the Usenet posts I've been reading. Yeah, the budget on Babylon 5 never exceeded 1 million. It maxed out in season 4 at 880,000 per episode.
Wow. And that's in comparison to, what was it, Star Trek at the time? Is that what he said?
Yeah, from Next Generation on, I don't think Star Trek has ever had a per episode budget below 1 million. Even in the first season of Star Trek The Next Generation, it held the record at the time for being the most expensive television series ever produced. And that record has been broken a few times. Until recently, it was held by Discovery, and then that was broken. The record is now held by Star Trek Strange New Worlds.
Do you think at the time, in the late 80s, early 90s, because we're in 1994, is that right?
Yes, this episode first aired on May 4th of 1994.
Okay, so we're right at the end of Next Generation's 7th season. Okay, so they're still doing practical effects for all their space shots and everything. Do you think that in the era of 1994, that all of the work with practical effects and all of the, it messed up, we have to do it again and rebuild the models and all that stuff that comes along with it would have been more expensive than just sitting in front of a computer and making the digital space effects?
JMS has explicitly stated that, yes, in 1994, they could not have told these stories with models.
Okay.
It would have been cost prohibitive.
Because I was listening to a book on Star Wars, The Secret History of Star Wars, because one of the things about Star Wars is everyone's like, practical effects are better than CGI effects. And yes, I like the look as well. But the Empire Strikes Back production crawled through the Dagobah scenes because the practical effects with the Yoda hand puppet were so problematic to pull off. It was very time consuming. And there were weeks where Mark Hamill was the only person on call because they just had to do all of those scenes. They were taking forever. So practical effects, yay, but also practical effects, wow, they're really hard to produce.
Yeah, I do agree that in a lot of cases they look better on screen.
Yeah, they do look better.
Yeah, even in this case, though, the CGI in Babylon 5 is a little bit dated. We could tell it's 1994. We could see the amount of gloss and reflections on them because partly it was rendered rather than ray traced, which is a bit of a difference. So rendering and ray tracing, there's a difference inside. So ray tracing is where usually they follow lines from the camera into the models, all the surfaces they reflect on until they get back to the light source and figure out exactly which wavelength of light would you see. Whereas rendering, it's not about tracing the light rays back. It's just doing a depiction. Rendering is a much faster process, but it is less realistic. So Babylon 5 was rendered, whereas the CGI dinosaurs in Jurassic Park were ray traced because they had to mesh with the physical dinosaurs where they had the physical models.
Right. The other thing I asked him about was Garibaldi's alcoholism, and I liked how he responded about that. Just because there's such a reality to that, and that's a definite serious issue. I mean, I don't want to say that this issue and the one I'm about to mention are of the same type. However, they're similar in the fact that they should be treated with appropriate after effect. And that would be like, the drinking issues with Garibaldi versus assault on a character. The emotional ramifications and everything, and the fallout of that is real and should not be glossed over in storytelling. And as we're moving through this season, I'm wondering if Straczynski is beginning to feel those sorts of needs as well, and therefore the need to change his storytelling approach to the series.
Might be a little bit. A lot of this he had planned. So I suspect, as Zicree mentioned, that they did soften the alcoholism in this one, and that they would return to that thread later. That's part of giving form to the dream. I wonder if they soften it here because hitting it as hard as Zicree had planned the first time would have made it harder to escalate when it comes back.
Okay.
And you have to escalate if you bring it up again, or it just feels like a repetition.
Right.
So I don't know how much of it is, he's getting tougher because he realizes we need to get tougher over time, and how much of that is just we're starting soft because we're going to be doing these themes again.
Okay.
And we're going to hit them harder the second time just to maintain that engagement.
I think
From what I've read so far, I don't know for sure which way it is.
I think if I had been in the conversation about those decisions, which of course I'm not because I'm sitting here a viewer 30 years later, hey, that's a show, I would have suggested that we not take him so far down that road if we're not going to be honest with how much it should affect him in the end, Because I feel like he went pretty far here and then just, boop, I'm okay. And so if they want to escalate things later, they should have made it a less of an investment this time. You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I do appreciate in the last conversation he has with Sinclair, when Sinclair is going, hey, you done good. And he says, no, I blew it.
Mm-hmm.
I did like the fact that he was harder on himself than anyone else around there.
And any degree of blowing it, that would have been a good line. Like, I like that line. Whether they had him drink less or as much as they did, him realizing that failure on his own part, failure in his own eyes, I like that.
Yeah. Even if it had been just one drink,
mm-hmm.
would have been enough for him to say, I blew it.
Yeah. Because he knows that it's going to be hard to stop at just one. And, there are ways they could have changed the structure of the story to have him not have the opportunity to drink further. There are ways of changing that. But anyways, not that big a deal. But yeah, the reconciliation of a broken relationship, basically almost a family relationship. That was the theme here, and I really appreciated the story. I thought it was a really strong episode.
Yeah, I did really like it. And if we want to get into our last best hope.
Mm-hmm.
So what would your last best hope be? What was the standout moment?
So with such a heavy episode, I'm going to go with one of the lighter moments. Because Ivanova, oh my gosh. She was so good in the few moments that she had. And whenever she says to Kemmer, you will resist, won't you? It's like, please, I want to fight you. I just love her presence.
Yeah, honestly, my debate on this was between two different Ivanova moments.
Okay.
Like I said during the interview, he didn't use her often, but he used her so well.
Mm-hmm.
So that is one of them, where she says, you are going to resist, I hope. And the other one is where she calls for the con officer to start that, I think it was a level 6 diagnostic, or start a diagnostic on the communication system. But that'll tie up the communication system for hours. Yes, I believe it will. Just, this is her plan. She is shutting down communication.
And the follow up on that, when she's like, I demand to have access to the communication. She's like, I don't take demands, but if you'd like to make a request, fine. I request. Request denied. Have a good day. That was just so good.
Yeah.
Love her.
Yeah, that's, I was happy with a lot of the casting in The Gathering, but I am happy that the actress who played Takashima, that she and Babylon 5 parted ways, because it gave us room for Ivanova.
Mm-hmm.
And Ivanova is wonderful.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know how much of this we would have seen in Takashima instead, but Ivanova she's had some great moments, and there are nobody has had their best moment in the series yet, by a long shot.
Yeah, it's kind of, whenever something gets canceled that been enjoying, you're looking forward to, it's sad. It's the opportunity cost is real. But when you get something equally or more gratifying as a replacement, it's like, okay, I'll forgive you.
Mm-hmm. All right, so shall we just highlight some bits that will come up in the future?
Yes. I'll let you take this because I think I know what topic you're going to hit on.
Yeah, one of them was stated explicitly now a couple of times. This is not the last time that Garibaldi is going to have to get his alcoholism under control. Now, that's not the only piece here. Some of that is that we know part of the time he was out of control and not trusting himself was when he was working on Mars Colony.
Mm-hmm.
So that will be relevant again in the future. We also know that the people at the Home Front organization, that Earthbound terrorist organization, seem to have been targeting President Santiago, or at least trying to make things rough for him on his arrival.
Right.
So it's whether they were trying to hit him or just time it to his arrival, we don't know. But even though he won on a platform of reducing alien influence on Earth, there clearly are elements who don't think he's taking that far enough.
Right. And we've seen his election, and we've dealt with the I always forget the name. It's at Home Guard. What's the Earth terrorist organization?
I'm trying to remember what it is here, to be honest. I'm reading the scripts in advance, and I've accelerated my reading to try and catch the foreshadowing.
Right.
So in reading the scripts, I am near the end of season 3.
Okay, and things change and names change. So the xenophobic, bigoted, hateful terrorist organization, we've seen that whole background situation developing on Earth. We've heard about the dynamics between humans and non-humans, shifting negatively on Earth. And so seeing that continue to play out here, even though we are so many light years from home, home's presence is very much felt on the station.
It is. And I'm honestly not sure how many light years away from Earth we are.
Well, even one is a lot.
We will soon learn exactly how many light years away from Narn we are.
Yes. Anything else to give form to the dream?
That's all that comes to mind now. So hopefully I'm not forgetting too much. That is one thing I've noticed from going back editing. It's, I forgot to mention this, and I forgot to mention this. So for all the foreshadowing that I'm saying is happening, there's more.
It's all right. We'll figure it out when we get there. And you can always say, I should have mentioned this before. This actually came up.
Yeah, so listeners, if you catch something I missed, you can let us know by emailing us at Babylon5 30 years later at gmail.com, using letters or numerals.
You can also reach out to the show by leaving comments on our website. Either website, the first being my own podcast website, which is johnreadscomics.com. There is no H in John. All of my current podcasting endeavors are there. And yeah, just find the episode posting and leave a comment, and we will read it on the show unless you tell us not to.
Same goes for Bureau42.com, which is the home for all of my podcast endeavors.
And there's no H in Bureau 42, right?
No.
Okay, good. You can also leave us reviews. We always appreciate it, letting other would-be listeners hear the things you have to say about the show, especially if they're good things. If they're not nice things, that's, I guess, fine, because honesty is usually the best policy. But leave reviews. If you leave them in Apple Podcasts, we will check that as a matter of course on a regular basis. If you leave them somewhere else and would like us to recognize you on the show, just drop us a line through one of the other channels to let us know you left a review, and we'll go get it and read it and thank you for it on the air.
You can also leave comments on our YouTube posts, because all of these episodes are cross-posted on YouTube. The visual will just be a title card with a visualizer. You don't always want to see what we look like with the cameras, so those are not in regular use.
I guess we're probably, I've always thought I had a really great face for radio.
Yeah, and considering that our most common recording time is about 6 a.m. in my time zone, I am often doing it with bedhead and a housecoat, so...
Actually, yeah, Blaine and I have the video on while we're recording here, which you can't see, but usually we don't, because we're both kind of like, I just woke up.
All right, so then we typically end with the Zocalo, just a spot to advertise other podcasts. This time we are not going with a podcast. So I'm going to head over to Mr. Zicree's YouTube channel. That's Mr. Sci-Fi. And see if he's got a trailer for Space Command, in which case you will get the audio of that trailer at the end instead. So thank you for listening.
We'll be back next week with, what is it, By Any Means Necessary?
Yes.
All right.
Yeah, By Any Means Necessary, which had the original air date of May 11th, 1994.
Okay, and until then, good eating to you.
The soar up there, that's what it's about. We fly. That's what we cameras do.
Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the first of what will soon be legions of contented synthetic workers. We suffered a catastrophic incident at one of our mining facilities in the asteroid belt. And in the chaos that followed, one of our pieces of equipment suffered a serious malfunction and has gone missing.
Kicking in the thrusters. Lieutenant Bradbury, match their speed.
Yes, sir.
I do not yet know what the ship might do if provoked.
You speak as if it were alive.
On occasion, machines are.
You've got him in your sights. You have to go after him.
You should not have saved my skin, Jack. He was counting on your humanity.
Doubt that I know my duty, Captain. You put it in your report.
You put that in yours. This is suicide.
That's the only way that we can rescue those hostages.
Stand down!
You'd vaporize everybody on Earth?
Our orders are wrong.
Slavery will tend to go badly.
You let all your people die.
Even when faith is shaken, one can always hold on to hope.